Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a este último encuentro del Junio Clásico 2024, en el que muy alegremente vamos a estar compartiendo una clase abierta junto con Laura Gibbs y Héctor Tapia. Eh, Voy a hacer la presentación de ustedes en español para quienes están presentes, eh, y luego van a poder comenzar su exposición. Para quienes se van sumando ahora, por las dudas, tienen en el chat el link a un drive en donde tienen la traducción de la conferencia que va a ser en inglés, donde pueden ir siguiéndola. Y además, en el final hay un handout con los textos que nos van a estar compartiendo Laura y Héctor. Así que bueno, voy a presentarlos y después de su exposición vamos a hacer un intercambio de preguntas. Laura Gibbs se licenció y doctoró en la Universidad de California, en Berkeley, donde estudió lenguas clásicas y eslavas. Luego impartió cursos de folclore y mitología en la Universidad de Oklahoma, hasta que se jubiló en el 2021. Ahora trabaja con proverbios griegos y en muchos otros proyectos. Y si quieren conocer más de esos proyectos, pueden visitar su sitio web, que es lauragibbs.net. No sé, Ivana, si querés también ponerlo en el chat, así ya les queda a quienes se van sumando. Héctor Tapia se licenció en literatura clásica en la Universidad Estatal de California, en Fresno, y actualmente es estudiante del doctorado en literatura comparada en la Universidad de California, la UCDavis. Es un estudioso de la tradición de las fábulas esópicas, y su trabajo académico se trata de examinar la división entre humanos y animales, cuestionar la forma en que los autores han trabajado con los animales o abusado de ellos, veremos ahora, no humanos, y para que sirvan de telón de fondo para explorar nuestros valores morales y nuestras luchas de identidad. El proyecto de doctorado examina las antiguas fábulas animales y su polinización cruzada en el Mediterráneo antiguo, Europa y las Américas, explorando cuestiones que tienen que ver con la colonización, el dolor animal, las figuraciones de la indigeneidad y las delineaciones también de esta red. Entonces, sin más, nuevamente agradecerles. Thank you so much, Laura and Héctor, por haber, acá Sandra capaz ayudarme, por haber aceptado esta invitación. Y bueno, es un placer estar compartiendo este momento con ustedes.
So
So,
thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and for accepting to be with us in this lesson today. And we hope it's very fruitful for everyone.
gracias, Sandra. So you can start whenever you want. Thank you again.
Okay, so I will be starting off. So our title of the thing is called A Round Trip Through Aesop's Fables, Promethea, Epimethea, Endomithea, and Allegory. One of the most traveled and cross-pollinated literary traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world is the fable. Functioning originally as an oral tradition, fables spoke to their audiences through anthropomorphic animals, or at times generic human characters, providing exempla, often negative, of human behavior. These oral fables were not a standalone genre. Instead, they were used as a rhetorical tool in oral performance, with a particular aim and context, providing both entertainment and moral instruction to their audiences, much like the related rhetorical genres such as proverbs and anecdotes. Later, as the fables began to shift from oral context into written context, the authors provided guidance about how the fables could be applied to a variety of situations. In some written collections, the reader was the intended audience, with moral instruction directed at that hypothetical reader and the circumstances of their lives. In other written collections, fables were intended as raw material to be reused in speeches of various kinds, and the authors of those rhetorical handbooks sometimes made specific recommendations about how a given fable could be deployed in a specific context. These augmented morals opened up new doors and possibilities for multiple readings. And in our presentation today, we will be focusing on the shifting landscape of the morals of the fables. Because of their simple plots and generic characters, fables were able to cross the tenuous bridge of different historical and cultural contexts, making long journeys in both time and space, especially when they began to circulate in writing as well as orally. The grand Aesopic tradition is not limited to the glory of Greece and Rome, as the Latin fable flourished for nearly 2,000 years all throughout Europe. In this talk, Laura and I will offer some classical and medieval fables with a focus on how the moralizing happens differently in these different historical and rhetorical contexts. One of the things that happens as fables are retold and new morals are added to the stories is that the fables become increasingly polyphonic, with a single fable containing multiple voices, even contradictory ones. Already in their ancient oral form, a single fable could contain multiple voices, the voices of different characters and the voice of the narrator. Then in a written fables, the editor's voice can often be heard. In addition to polyphony within a given fable, the genre itself is polyphonic. You could even call it chaotic, because the Aesopic corpus in antiquity already contained not only moralizing fables, but also jokes, ideologies, and other short narratives. Over time, the genre became increasingly heterogeneous. Any kind of short narrative could become an Aesopic fable, provided that it had some kind of moral, no matter how awkwardly the moral might fit onto the story. So, with every retelling, every rewriting, every collection, and every adaptation, new voices became part of the fable tradition, and those new voices were speaking to new audiences. As a result, the fables are not fixed moralized entities, but are rather mutable enigmas, or as the Aesopic scholar Ben Edwin Perry declared, a fable is as fable does. So let's take a look at some fables and see what they are doing, and in particular, what they are doing with the moral of the fable. Starting with one of the oldest recorded fables, Hesiod's account of the hawk and nightingale from the Work and Days. And now I will tell a fable, Ainon, for kings, basileisusen, who are capable of understanding, phronesusi kai autois. This is what the hawk said to the speckled nightingale as he carried her high up among the clouds, gripped in his talons, while she wept miserably. Eleon mureto. Pierced by his curved talons, he viciously, epigrateos, spoke this word, muthon, to her. My lady, what are you shrieking for? Tileleikas. Someone stronger by far, Polon Ireon, holds you, and you will go wherever I take you, singer though you are. And if I please, I will make a meal of you, or I will let you go. Only a fool, Aphron, struggles with those who are stronger. Cresonas, he cannot win, and he adds pain to his shame. So spoke the swiftly flying hawk, the bird with the long wings. Hesiod then adds this remark directed to his brother Perseus. But you, Sude, Perseus, listen to justice, case, and do not escalate violence. Mende hubrin, Ophele. What an unfortunate fate for our nightingale. She does not even get to speak in defense for the story. All she can do is weep and shriek, while the hawk gets to do all the talking. As Hesiod deploys this story in a context of the larger poem, he weaves a moralizing apparatus into the fable in three ways. First, there is a promethium that addresses kings, telling them that this is an ainos that they need to understand. Ainos being one of the words used in Greek to indicate a fable. Ainos could also refer to a proverb or riddle, showing that what are, in English, three affiliated folk genres were perceived as one single genre by the Greeks. Second, there is a moral inside the story, an endomitium, when the hawk tells the nightingale that it is useless to resist, as if the lesson to be learned is that might makes right. The hawk speaks to her in a way that asserts his mastery over her verbally, epikrateos, just as he physically pierces her with his talons. He declares himself to be far stronger or superior to her, polon areon, and declares her to be a fool, aphron, someone without understanding, because she insists on struggling with those who are stronger. Cresonas, in a fight, she cannot win. Then there is an epimitium, a moral after the fable, which Hesiod addresses to his brother, telling him to obey justice and warning him of the dangers that come with enacting violence as hubris. The poem goes on. Hesiod tells his brother that men who engage in such violence bring about their own ruin. These three morals present us with several interpretive problems. Instead of making the fable more clear, the multiple morals make the fable much more confusing. This is an example of the kind of contradiction and even chaos that I mentioned earlier. One source of confusion is how the audience is supposed to feel about these characters. Even though the fable itself, the hawk gets the last biting words, the pitiful description of the nightingale screeching surely arouses our pity, as does her miserable sobbing. Then in the epimythium, Hesiod appears to denounce the violence of the hawk as unjust, once again eliciting sympathy for the nightingale. Yet at the same time, Hesiod does not let the nightingale speak or sing. All she can do is shriek and sob. This then relates to a second source of confusion. Who exactly does Hesiod imagine as the audience of this fable? Is it the wise kings, the Basileisusin Phroneususi, invoked in the Prometheum, or are they supposed to identify with the hawk in his power, but then to reject him for his injustice and hubris, as the Epimythium says? Or is the audience instead his brother Perseus, to whom the Hesiod addresses the Epimythium? And finally, a third source of confusion. What is the moral of the story after all? The hawk clearly tells us in the endomythium that the weak ones of the world have no logical choice but to submit to those in power. But does Hesiod then undermine that moral when he passes a moral judgment of his own on the dangers of hubris? Does that overpowering bird stand in for all unjust men who hold authority, as if they are animals who cannot listen to decay, while his brother Perseus, or perhaps the kings, can and should listen to that voice of justice? This then raises even broader philosophical and moral questions such as what is justice? And are power and justice mutually exclusive? These are all questions which remain open at the end of the fable. It is an ainos indeed, an enigma or riddle, one which may have multiple solutions. In keeping with this theme of justice and injustice and the contrast between justice and violence, I'm now going to skip ahead from 700 BCE to the 1st century CE in order to examine a fable from the Roman poet Phaedrus. Hesiod's fable was part of a larger poem, an oral composition, while Phaedrus was instead a literary author of fables, and he wrote several books of fables, the first extant fable collections to have survived from the ancient Greek and Roman world. The biographical information we have about Phaedrus only comes from his poems, but at least according to his own report, he was an enslaved Thracian who was brought to Rome, where he would have then become a freedman in the household of the Emperor Augustus. As you would expect then, Phaedrus's fables are often tinged with themes of his lived experience of being an enslaved person. With zealous literary ambition, Phaedrus claimed to be the first poet to put fables in writing, leaving a corpus of several books containing about 120 fables in total, not counting the lost versions that only survive in medieval prose paraphrases. As it was for Hesiod, justice was an important theme for Phaedrus, and like Hesiod, Phaedrus also struggled to fit the traditional fable narratives into his moral framework. Let us take a look at how the story complicates the moral and vice versa in Phaedrus's fable of the wolf and the lamb. Compelled by thirst, a wolf and a lamb came to the same river, and the wolf was stationed above, superior, and the lamb far below, longe inferior. Then the plunderer, urged on by his wicked throw, fauce improba, produced an excuse for his malice, iurgi causam intulit. Why, he said, have you soiled the water that I am drinking? The woolly one said fearfully, O wolf, please, how could I have done what you accuse me of? The water flows down from where you to where I drink. The wolf, rebuffed by the power of truth, repulsus ille veritatis vidibus, said, 6 months ago you insulted me. And the lamb replied, in fact, I wasn't even born then. The wolf said, your father by Hercules insulted me. And so the wolf seized the lamb and tore him to pieces in an unjust murder, in justia nece. This fable was written because of those people who oppress the innocent, innocentes opprimunt, with false charges. Phaedrus does not have a promethium as Hesiod did, and there is not, strictly speaking, an endomythium. The wolf and the lamb debate back and forth, and the wolf does get the last word, but he does not lecture the lamb as Hesiod's hawk lectured the nightingale. Instead, we hear Phaedrus's voice intruding into the fable itself, and it is Phaedrus who gets the last word in the narrative. What the wolf has done is a crime, declares the author, in Justia Nece. Then Phaedrus speaks unambiguously in the epimythium. The fable is about people like the wolf who oppress the innocent, like the lamb with false charges. This theme of justice is clearly important to Phaedrus because he puts the fable first in his first book of fables. Moreover, he uses the moral and ethical landscape of the story itself to provide a critique of uneven power dynamics. As the story opens, Phaedrus explicitly establishes those uneven dynamics. The wolf spatially occupies a far higher position than the lamb. Yet, unlike Hesiod's nightingale, Phaedrus's lamb from his lowly position does engage in a dialogue with the wolf, albeit futile. Phaedrus thus opens up a world wherein the downtrodden not only have a voice, but can also use it. Moreover, it is the physical positioning of the two animals which provides the key element of the lamb's initial defense. How could I, says the lamb, lowly as I am, be causing any problems for you way up there? The lamb's able defense is not enough to save him. He falls victim to the wolf just as the nightingale was doomed to be the hawk's supper. Yet Phaedrus insists that the lamb's failure is not justification for the wolf's exertion of power. In fact, in the epimythia, Phaedrus uses the lamb's death to illuminate and criticize the hypocrisy of the wolf. The plot of the story shows the lamb as a victim, but with the moral of the story, Phaedrus labels the wolf a moral loser. Although in some sense the lamb might be considered foolish for trying to reason with the wolf, Hesiod's hawk would definitely label the lamb a fool, just like the nightingale. Phaedrus alerts the audience as to the wolf's hypocrisy through the narrative details, as well as through the lamb's honest retorts. As a result, while the wolf may win the physical struggle in the story, he becomes a negative focal point of the moral. And what is more, Phaedrus tells us that people of lower social standing can use the truth as a weapon to combat exploitation and injustice. Although the lamb lost in the end, the wolf was rebuffed by the power of truth, repulsus veritatis vidibus. So while the lamb does meet a gruesome fate, we nonetheless align ourselves on the side of the lamb, and its unjust death in Justia Neke takes on a powerful symbolic value. Because the lamb dies in protest, we can make the case that he dies a martyr for truth, standing up against injustice, a moral perspective that cannot emerge in Hesiod because the poet does not give his nightingale anything to say. For both Hesiod and Phaedrus, the predatory animal serves as a negative exemplum in the epimythium, but in Phaedrus, the dynamic of the fable becomes an interpretive lens with which to read that epimythium. Even though the moral admits that the high and mighty will always invent excuses for their action, the story tells us that the weak can nevertheless speak up, using their voices to expose the hypocrisy of those in power. After these two sad and very serious fables, I want to look at a different kind of fable next. It's not an animal story. Instead, it's a joke about people, specifically a joke about a pregnant woman in labor. This joke also appears in Phaedrus' first book of fables and presents us with a different kind of interpretive dilemma. Why would Phaedrus include a joke in his collection of fables? Unlike the moral of a fable that has an ethical purpose, the punchline of a joke does not teach a lesson, or does it? Let us look at how Phaedrus moralizes this little joke. No one willingly revisits nemo libente recollet, a place that has hurt them, quae laesit locum. With months having passed and birth approaching, a woman stretched out on the ground, producing pitiful groans. Her husband implored her to take herself to the bed, where she would be better able to deliver nature's burden. The woman said, I have no trust at all, mini me confido, that a bad business can be concluded posse malam finiri, in the very place where it was conceived to begin with, illo loco quo conceptum est initio. Already in his first book of fables, Phaedrus shows that the fables genre is a large tent that can contain more than the animal fables you might expect from the traditional Aesopic corpus. Here, Phaedrus engages in a genre game by finding affinities shared between the fable and the joke. Specifically, they both have a punchline. In a more traditional Aesop's, the punchline is a moral lesson at the end of the story. In a joke, however, the punchline is purely for entertainment. Relying on the structural similarity, Phaedrus, now writing as both fabulist and joker, can go beyond teaching his audience through fables that exploit violence and pain, like the lamb who was torn to pieces by the wolf. With the addition of jokes to his repertoire, Phaedrus can tell funny stories that provide entertainment, while also exploiting that laughter for a moral lesson, which now comes in the form of a promethium, putting the moral before the story so that the punchline can still work its magic unimpeded at the end. To see just how that works, let us examine the complexity of Phaedrus' moralized joke by contrasting the promethium from the author with the punchline delivered by the woman. On the surface, the moral teaching of Phaedrus' promethium is an obvious truism. People learn from bad experiences so that they don't make the same mistake twice. If something bad happened to you somewhere, just don't go back there again. Yet, surprisingly, the story that follows is not an animal anecdote that readers might expect. Instead, Phaedrus tells a story about human sex. The husband and wife had sex in their bed, and now months later, the woman is certainly not going to go back into that bed. She's not going to make the same mistake twice. It's almost as she heard Phaedrus whispering the advice that he offers offstage in the Prometheum. Don't go back to a place where you previously got in trouble. In this way, Phaedrus amplifies the humor of the situation by adding the moral at the beginning. And at the same time, he reinforces the moral by having the woman repeat it, however misguided her application of the moral might be. Thus, the woman is both wise and foolish, and the figure of the wise fool is very much part of the Aesopic tradition. And you can see that same archetype in the anecdotes that Phaedrus will tell about Aesop himself in the later books of his fables. Phaedrus let the woman have the last word, and we can see that in a certain sense she is no fool. She understands the connection between sex and childbirth. She knows exactly how she became pregnant, by having sex in that bed. Phaedrus does not allow the husband to refute his wife's obtuse way of thinking. Instead, Phaedrus lets the woman in her foolish wisdom have the last word. But with the addition of the promethium, the sexual fool is no longer the butt of the joke. Now she is the unwitting vehicle for proverbial wisdom. There is indeed good advice which appears by way of masquerade in the punchline of the joke, even if that advice does not fit the poor woman's situation very well. This ingenious little experiment, so different from the fable of the wolf and the lamb, shows how Phaedrus embraced a wide definition of the fable genre as both moralizing and entertaining, silly as well serious. So, with these three classical fables, I hope to have given you a sense of the polyphony, or rather, the polyfunctionality that you can find in the Aesop's fables of Greece and Rome. And now I will turn things over to Laura, who also has a joke and two fables to share with you.
That's great. Thank you, Hector. Well, as Hector already mentioned, the Latin tradition of Aesop's fables thrived long after Phaedrus's name was long forgotten. In addition to the prose paraphrases of Phaedrus's poems, which circulated under the generic name of Romulus, medieval authors added many new fables in both prose and verse. Most of them were animal fables, although others were stories about animals drawn from the bestiary tradition. In addition to all the animals, just as Phaedrus included stories about the Olympian gods and goddesses in his Aesopic fables, the medieval fable writers told stories about Bible characters, as well as stories about saints and devils, plus plenty of jokes about husbands and wives. For my part of our talk, I will introduce you to Odo of Sheraton, whom I consider to be the best of the medieval fabulists. And I'll offer you one of Odo's jokes, then his version of a classic Aesop's fable, and I'll close with one of Odo's own fables about justice, echoing the justice fables that Hector shared from Hesiod and Phaedrus. Odo of Sheraton was born near the end of the 12th century in England, and his writing career spanned the first half of the 13th century. And that puts us a full 2,000 years after Hesiod. Odo was educated in France, and he also lived for a time in Spain. His collection of over 100 fables in prose, along with almost 200 additional stories that can be extracted from his sermons, were published together in Volume 4 of Hervieux's Anthology of Medieval Latin Fables. There is a modern English translation of Odo's fables, but not the sermons, by John Jacobs, and there's also a medieval Castilian version of Odo's fables entitled Libro de los Gatos, recently published in a new edition by David Arbesu in 2022. Something new that Christian authors like Odo bring to the Aesopic tradition is the use of allegory, in addition to the traditional moral apparatus of the fable. In an allegorical interpretation, the story in the fable is retold as a new story, a story that is both the same and also different from the story in the fable. The allegory is what you might call a hidden story. For example, you might have thought Odo was telling you a story about a fox and a crow, but no, that was actually a story about the devil. You might have thought he was telling you a story about a frog and a mouse, but no, that was actually a story about a preacher and his congregation. The stories Odo tells often come from the classical Aesopic tradition, but his style of interpretation instead is more like the way that Jesus interpreted his parables in the Gospels, where one story is hidden inside another story, and the audience might not unlock that hidden meaning on their own if Jesus did not provide the key. Just to show you how creative allegorical interpretations can be, I'm going to start with a joke that Odo told in one of his sermons, a funny joke to which he adds a very unfunny allegorical interpretation. By using allegory, Odo is authorized both to tell a joke to entertain his audience and also to supply that joke with the kind of moral you would expect in a Christian sermon. So here's the joke. There was a certain king who reveled in the glory of the world, gloria mundi. He commanded that the floors and the walls of his palace be covered with expensive fabrics, cortinis pretiosis, and that the dining table be decorated with a beautiful tablecloth and vessels of gold and silver. Mensam mappa et aures vasis et argenteis fecit ornari. A certain philosopher, sapiens quidam, was invited to dine with the king. During the meal, he needed to spit something out. But where could he spit? He looked around for somewhere to spit, but everywhere he looked was covered with decorations. Omnia loca ornamentis coaperta. He couldn't spit on the expensive carpet. He couldn't spit on the fancy tablecloth. He couldn't spit into the golden plates or silver bowls. So where did he spit? He spit into the king's beard. The king's servants leaped up and grabbed the philosopher, but the king restrained them and asked the philosopher why he spit at him like that. The philosopher replied that everything in the room was lovely to look at, except for the king's beard, smeared as it was with grease from the rich food, thus making it the most vile place in the room. And that was why he spit into the king's beard. When the wise man spits into the king's beard, it's a way of speaking truth to power. The philosopher is not wealthy and mighty like the king, but he's smart, and so he can apparently get away with insulting the king by relying on his quick wit and intelligence, unlike the poor nightingale in Hesiod or the poor lamb in Phaedrus. And this philosopher is also a wise fool. He is sapiens, as the fable tells us, but he also acts like a fool, spitting in the king's beard. Of course, there are all kinds of wise fools. Phaedrus's pregnant woman is more fool than wise, while this philosopher is more wise than fool. But nevertheless, they can both share the label of wise fool, as is true of the protagonists of so many jokes, ancient, medieval, and modern. But when we turn to Odo's allegory of the story, it turns out that Odo does not want us to focus on the wise man. Instead, the allegory focuses on the king and his palace. In Odo's allegorical interpretation, you are the king, and the king's palace is your body. Sic ergo corpus tuum studiose adornaveris. This is the same as when you eagerly adorn your body. Like the king, you are guilty of loving the glory of the world, gloria mundi, because you adorn your body with precious clothing and with gold and silver jewelry, just as the king adorned his palace with precious carpets and gold and silver vessels. With just a single word, adornaveris, Odo allows you to map your body onto the king's palace, which the king fecit ornari ornamentis, as the story explained in abundant detail. Next comes the allegory of the spit. After you have been stripped naked, demons will spit their stinking hot spit, fetido sputo et calido, into your face in hell. The joke is funny, but there is nothing funny about this allegorical story. As Christian doctrine teaches us, in death we will leave behind our bodies, and all earthly glory will be stripped away. If you commit the sin of loving that earthly glory instead of loving God in this life, you will be condemned to spend the afterlife in hell, where apparently demons are going to spit into your face. just as the philosopher spit into the king's beard. No, that does not mean the philosopher is a demon in disguise, and it does not mean that the demons are philosophers. All Odo needs to make the allegory work is the spit. So that's all he brings from the philosopher into the allegory, the spit, and nothing but the spit. Odo tells us that these two stories are logically the same, sic ergo. But at the same time, we know they are not the same. The joke and the allegory serve very different rhetorical purposes. Odo wants you to enjoy the joke, and that is why he tells it so well, with so many great details that he does not actually need for the allegory. Instead, the joke has a purpose of its own. He wants you to laugh at the joke. It's funny. But Odo also wants you to take the afterlife seriously, and that is why he tells the allegory with its own vivid details about the afterlife. You're stripped naked. You're in hell. And it's not just normal spit you feel on your face. It is the hot and stinking spit of demons. Thus, the allegory also has a purpose of its own, and it is no laughing matter. You need to set aside earthly delights and love God, and you better do that now before it's too late. This joke about spitting into the king's beard was a popular medieval story found in other sources, but the allegory here is Odo's own. It is his creative contribution to the medieval tradition of this particular joke. Next, to show you how Odo uses allegory with a classical fable, I'll discuss his version of the crow and borrowed feathers. The story starts with a promethium, a little moral before the story begins, letting us know that the story will denounce those who boast, jactantse. Oh, and I just have to say to Hector, that's jactantse, like we saw in the story this morning. Okay, jactantse, that they have something that they do not have. This, by the way, is an example of an editorial promethium. Odo intended his collection of fables for use by other preachers, helping them to find fables to use in their sermons. And the promethium was intended to help them find the fables that would suit their needs. Then, after the promethium comes the story. A crow was unhappy because she was ugly and black, turpem et nigram. So she complained to the eagle, who told her to take feathers from the other birds. She got a tail from the peacock, wings from the dove, and so on, taking whatever she liked from all the other birds. When she saw herself adorned, videin se ornatam, this made her so proud that she started to mock the other birds. They got angry and complained to the eagle, who told them to each take back their own feathers, thus humiliating the crow. When the other birds took back their feathers, the crow was less turpis et nuda, ugly and naked. Notice that the crow was originally upset because she was ugly and black, turpis et nigra. At the end, though, there is a shift. She is not black, but naked, nuda. And nakedness will be one of the keys that Odo uses to unlock the allegorical story, which is introduced with the word sic, just as in the allegory of the king that we saw earlier. In the same way, sic, the pathetic human being boasts about his adornments, de ornatu suo superbit. The linking word here is ornatu, echoing the word ornatam in the story, while superbit echoes the jactantse in the promethium.
This might answer your question.
Oh,
Yorkton is a city located
hang
in
on just a
southeastern
second. I am so sorry about that. My
problem.
father, who lived here, had a voice device to control his stereo because he was very sick. He couldn't get up and control his stereo. And it must have thought I was talking to it. So it started to talk to me. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Oh, okay, so we are like the crow. because we foolishly take pride in our appearance. But there is more to it than that. Odo then goes on to explain that we are also like the crow because we have taken our adornments from others, just like the crow borrowed those feathers. Our clothing is made from wool that we take from the sheep, from flax that we take from the earth, from leather that we take from cattle and goats, from fur that we take from rabbits and lambs. But as Odo warns us, just let the sheep take back its wool. Akipiat ois lanam suam. Let the earth take back her flax, the cattle and goats their leather, the lambs and rabbits their fur, and the pathetic human being will remain naked and ugly, nudus et turpis, just like the crow who was turpis et nuda. And this is not hypothetical. It really is going to happen. The sheep will take back her wool and so on when we are stripped naked on the day of our death. Ita fiat saltem in die mortis. So, as you can see, this allegorical story about the crow stripped naked of her feathers echoes the allegorical story about spitting into the king's beard. They are both allegorical stories of the Christian afterlife, when all earthly goods will be stripped of judgment. This story of the afterlife is a story that Odo repeats again and again. It is a kind of allegorical memento mori that Odo can find hidden everywhere he looks. A story about a philosopher who spits in a king's beard? That's really the story of what's going to happen to you after you die. A story about a crow and borrowed feathers? That's really a story about what's going to happen to you after you die. At the same time, however, nothing is objectively predictable when it comes to these allegorical interpretations. Odo has other allegorical stories, stories about salvation, charity, devotion, and so on, that he uses repeatedly. In addition, like both Hesiod and Phaedrus, Odo tells stories about justice and injustice. And I've selected one of Odo's fables about justice to end my part of this talk, bringing us around full circle to the fables that Hector started with. This is Odo's very short fable about the toad and the rake. A rake, traha, once passed over a toad, and one tooth, unos dens, struck her in the head. Another struck her in the heart, another in the kidneys. And the toad said, "So many masters, God damn them. Deus confundat tot dominos." That's it. That's the story. This is not a classical Aesop's fable, but it is a great little animal story, and a very realistic one. No, toads don't talk, but there really are all kinds of animals who do meet their death as an accidental result of human agriculture, including toads. Notice, however, that the toad has no idea that a human is involved. Her enemy is the rake itself, and not even the rake. All the toad knows is that there are teeth, lots of teeth, and those teeth are cutting her to pieces. There are teeth, but no mouth. The rake has nothing to say to the toad, and the toad has nothing to say to the rake. Instead, the toad shouts a prayer to God, asking God to confound these so many teeth, who are so many masters. Unlike Hesiod's nightingale, whose words were not recorded, and unlike Phaedrus's lamb, who did not get the last word in his dialogue with the wolf, the only speaker in this little fable is the poor oppressed toad, and she does get the last word, Deus confundat tot dominos, or in the medieval Castilian version from the Libro de los Gatos, confonda Dios tantos señores. Then, in the allegory, Odo tells us about all the kinds of teeth that cut lowly chaplains and poor peasants to pieces. Any chaplain can say the same. The archdeacon demands patronage, their officials demand horses, the squires demand shoes, and the grooms demand clothing or money. Likewise, bailiffs and sub-bailiffs and the servants and porters of a king or a viscount, They take what they want from a poor man, and then that poor man can only say, so many masters, God damn them. Deus confundat tot dominos. The allegory this time is actually longer than the story itself, because Odo wants you to fully appreciate the so manyness of the situation, the sheer number of the dentes. There are teeth that are high church officials and their minions, along with their squires and also their grooms, who are all squeezing the lifeblood out of the lowly chaplains. That's the religious allegory. There's a secular allegory too. The rake's teeth are the local bailiffs and also the sub-bailiffs, and likewise the king and the nobility, along with their servants and their porters, all of whom are squeezing the lifeblood out of the peasants. So in the end, all the chaplains and peasants can do is call on God to damn all those masters. Deus confundat tot dominos. Moreover, as we know from Odo's other stories, when those masters of the earth die and enter the afterlife, they are going to join the other lovers of earthly delights in hell. So as soon as the toad invokes God, she invokes the entire allegorical apparatus that goes with God, which includes the divine judgment. It's a bit like when Hesiod invokes Dike at the end of the fable of the hawk and the nightingale, as Dike is both the word for justice and also the name of the goddess of justice. The difference, of course, is that there is not really a Greek story about Dike that is automatically conjured up at the mere mention of her name, the way that there is a whole story about God's justice, which is conjured up for Odo and his audience when that toad calls on God. God may not confound the greedy, powerful people immediately in this lifetime, but God will indeed confound them for all eternity in the afterlife. In this way, God is a fixed point of reference in Odo's universe. But I want to add one final observation here about the toad. The toad is not a fixed point of reference. Instead, the toad is a polyvalent symbol. Sometimes for Odo, the toad is the embodiment of ugliness, especially deceptively seductive female ugliness. Sometimes the toad symbolizes Satan. But sometimes the toad is a sympathetic, lowly character, someone who can speak for a chaplain, like Odo himself, or for the poor peasants with whom Odo deeply sympathized, just as we saw the toads speak in this little fable. So, in conclusion, I hope that Hector and I have made you curious about classical and medieval fables, and not just about the stories, but about the morals too. We think it's fascinating when the morals are at odds with the story. It's another sign of the polyphonic, chaotic nature of the fable genre itself. Some scholars disagree. You might know that Ben Perry's student, Lloyd Daly, who went on to become an important classicist in his own right, published a translation of Perry's Aesopica into English entitled Aesop Without Morals, where he consigned all the Promethea and Epimethea to an appendix in the back of the book. So while Daly wanted to discourage his readers from pondering the morals of the fables, Hector and I are encouraging you to do just the opposite. Take a look at the morals, no matter how bizarre and enigmatic they might seem, and see if you can figure out what the morals are doing. Maybe you even have some ideas you want to share with us about the morals of the stories we have presented here today. It would be great to hear what you all think about that, along with any questions or comments that you want to share. So thank you. That's all.
Thank you so much, Héctor and Laura, for your presentation. That was very interesting. So now we can share some questions for you. No sé si podemos hacer algunas preguntas. Si alguien quiere comenzar, hay una mano levantada, Ivana. No se te escucha, a ver.
No, era el aplauso, aplauso.
Ah, hay un aplauso, sí.
Yes, of course.
Un aplauso.
No, decirle a los estudiantes que acá la tenemos a Sandra que nos va a ayudar a traducir, así que si quieren escribir una pregunta en español en el chat, Milena y Sandra pueden traducir la pregunta para Laura y para Héctor.
Sí.
¿Mm?
Cerramos el Junio
Bueno, yo
Clásico de la mejor manera con traductora y todos, así que también agradecerle a
sí,
Sandra por ayudarnos con esto. Así que
sí,
sí, si alguien
claro.
tiene preguntas, no sé, Ivana, ¿querés comenzar? O
Sí, algo para Laura puntualmente. Em, la diferencia, ¿cómo
Ah,
Oh, she froze.
yes.
definirías vos?
ahí está, ahí
Uy,
está.
ahí
Ivana,
estoy, ¿me escuchas?
¿podés repetir porque se te cortó? Si podés desde el
Ah,
principio.
sí, la diferencia para Laura entre fábula y alegoría.
Ah, yo le iba a preguntar lo mismo.
Ah, claro, porque lo estuvimos hablando con Milena el otro día y yo creo entender la propuesta de Laura, pero me gustaría escucharla de ella misma.
Do you understand, Laura? O
Yeah. Oh, sure.
okay.
It is a hard question.
Mm.
It's not so much the difference between fable and allegory, but how an allegory is not just any symbolic interpretation. And there's no objective answer to that question. But what I look for in an allegory is something that takes the shape of a new story, that you have the character in the fable is a new character in the allegory, and the action in the fable is a new kind of action in the allegory. And the way Odo does this specifically is to use a specific key word that he'll repeat. And he'll build the whole allegory just grabbing that word like nudus. You know, as soon as there is this word nudus and the fact that the crow has been stripped naked, that becomes for him the way a body is stripped naked at death. The crow doesn't die, but he wants his allegory to be about a stripped, naked, dead body at the time of death. So it's just a more elaborate symbolic apparatus that has characters and a plot of its own. That's how I use the word. Now, other people use the word differently. Like there's a genre of literary allegory where all the characters are abstractions, like virtue and justice, who go to war with hunger and lies, or something like that. That's a different kind of allegory. There are lots of kinds of allegory. So I don't know if that answers your question. The kind of allegory that Odo does is a specific kind of interpretive allegory.
Bien, gracias, thank you.
Does
Sandra,
that
no
make
sé si
sense?
querés decir en español brevemente
Sí,
una
sí.
síntesis.
Sí, sí, lo que está discutiendo Laura es que en el caso de este escritor Odo, no hay una nueva historia, un nuevo relato que sea la alegoría, sino que toma el mismo personaje y la misma acción y usa una palabra, en el caso de la que compartimos es nuda, para hablar de la desnudez, y con esa palabra es la llavecita que permite desbloquear la alegoría. Por supuesto que en su caso eran sermones, entonces se iba a referir a la desnudez del alma una vez que se debe desprender luego de la muerte de todo lo terrenal. No era así el caso de eh, el cuervo, que quedó sin las plumas y desnudo, pero vivo. Es como que la fábula va por su lado y la interpretación, la alegoría que interpreta Odo es otra porque su propósito es otro. Entonces, esto es como que enlaza con esto de no solo polifónico, sino también polifuncional, con respecto a lo que nuestros dos invitados de hoy estaban hablando.
Claro, y también mencionaba la diferencia con los relatos, otro uso de la palabra alegoría, que tiene que ver con los relatos que proponen, por ejemplo, hablan de la justicia, de la libertad, como ideas abstractas. Eso sería otro uso que Laura no plantea en este caso, digamos.
Claro, porque son conceptos abstractos los personajes de otras alegorías. La justicia y la verdad que luchan contra el hambre y como
Yo creo que eso es como
formando los bandos.
en el sentido común, en el common sense, es como el más usado, me parece, para alegoría, ese tipo de relatos. Es como, por lo menos acá, tengo como esa idea.
I don't know in Spanish literary tradition, but in the English literary tradition, there are many of these allegories with abstract characters. A very famous one is
Yes.
called Pilgrim's Progress, very religious with these abstractions as characters. And that's also called an allegory. Nothing to do with fables at all.
En la literatura inglesa también están numerosos casos de alegorías que no tienen nada que ver con las fábulas, donde los personajes de estos relatos son conceptos, abstracciones.
Bien,
Also,
tenía una
Laura, hay a question, o sea, relacionada con esto de la alegoría. Eh, Allegory can be also a reading practice. We can think like that. Allegory, like an interpretation.
Right. Although what I like about these allegories in Odo is they're from his sermons. They were delivered orally, and it really helps to read them out loud and hear the echoes of the word. And I love allegory, and I've worked on it a lot. I'm trying to convert Hector to allegory. So, Hector, you should say if you think allegory is useful for these fables or not. What do you think? Because he's becoming a medievalist. He's not a medievalist yet, but I'm trying to seduce him, make him a medievalist.
Está tratando de convencer a Héctor para que se convierta al medievalismo, porque está muy apasionada con la cuestión oral de todo lo que son los sermones, más allá de la lectura, el hecho de escucharlos con los ecos dentro de los oficios religiosos, tienen una atmósfera particular.
I think that's a good question. I think, if we look at just the classical tradition, there are already these kind of conflicting points of reference. We have these three competing morals, and I think when you add the allegory to it, while the allegory can be a lens, a sort of literary theory that you can apply to the fable, you also have to remind yourself that it can also further problematize the fable because you're having this large distance in both time and space, and another voice, a very Christian voice, is being applied to, in this context, what would be considered a very pagan text. So, how does that text operate in a non-Christological tradition versus how is it operated in a Christological tradition? So, I think the allegory is definitely a way to rethink the fable, but I think you have to be careful because animal characters don't maintain this semiotic value in every tradition. One animal may carry one connotation in. So, for example, I am working on a Nahuatl translation of the Aesopic fables. And before the Aztecs were conquered by the Spaniards, horses and donkeys were not native to the Americas. So when you have slave stories about donkeys in antiquity that are meant to be taught to the indigenous Nahuatls as, look at, you are a lowly downtrodden donkey. The Nahuatls don't understand this cultural baggage that this animal brings. So the allegorical value that is attached to these very religious Aesopic stories has no meaning to a culture that has a very different set of, cosmology and religion and cultural beliefs. So I think allegory is important and it is a lens, but you have to be mindful of the time period with which you are looking at. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Bueno, acá una
Yes,
respuesta
very
bastante
interesting.
compleja. Una
Sí,
respuesta bastante compleja.
vamos a tratar de armarla.
Donde Héctor nos está diciendo que no siempre las alegorías funcionan con respecto a una fábula, porque hay una distancia en tiempo y en cultura que muchas veces puede ser confusa. Y como ejemplo cita eh, el remate de eres un burro tonto, cuando se trataba de cristianizar, pongamos, a los indígenas náhuatl, y para ellos los caballos y los burros no son nativos del continente americano, y no era posible comprender de ninguna manera a qué se estaba refiriendo ese remate precisamente. Entonces, es como que hay que tomar con muchas pinzas eh, los personajes y las acciones que tantos años atrás se generaron en una cultura completamente distinta. Sobre todo porque, además de las culturas, hay una cuestión de lo que es pagano y lo que es, en este caso, cristiano, católico. ¿Sí? No sé, Mile, si me olvidé algo.
No, creo que lo resumiste muy bien. No
Yo
sé si,
tenía
bueno, ¿alguna otra pregunta? Ajá.
una pregunta para Héctor. La formulo despacio, quizás comprende en español. Hesíodo, ¿qué fábula? ¿Mm? Es la primera en Grecia. ¿Mm? Sin
Oh,
Ay,
she
a ver,
froze.
moment, yes.
embargo, por ahora
Ivana,
me escuchan, ¿me
Sí, sí,
escuchan?
ahora
sí.
sí.
Por la riqueza del uso de Hesíodo de esa fábula, pareciera que ya cuando Hesíodo la usa, ya es una tradición consolidada en Grecia. ¿Qué pensás sobre eso? ¿Entendiste o Sandra puede quizás traducir?
Hector, Ivana is asking you if Hesiod uses this fable when, and it's very rich what he gets. So, was it a long-term story previous to his using it or not?
I think that's the a question that is perhaps almost unanswerable is asking this kind of is he the first person to create a story? And I think that's kind of our problem as modern readers is that we want to treat Aesopic fables as a book that someone wrote it down first, therefore they are the originator of it. I'm not convinced on this idea that he wrote it himself. It was obviously probably circulating the Mediterranean, and it probably carried this kind of cultural baggage for them. All we can confirm, say with confidence is that he was the first person to write it down within a larger body of work. But I'm sure that this was already circulating. If only we had a time machine and we can go back and figure out what was
That would
going
be
on.
great.
Sí,
La
yes.
respuesta es, Ivana, que posiblemente haya estado circulando en las culturas mediterráneas, pero la respuesta es prácticamente imposible de encontrar,
Claro,
aunque
por
nos
supuesto,
gustaría tener una máquina del tiempo.
claro, tal cual.
Lo que sí podemos saber es que es el primero en ponerlas por escrito, pero posiblemente ya haya tenido un bagaje que no podemos confirmar ni negar.
Exactamente. Mm.
¿Alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta? Si no, yo tengo una también. No, pero vamos a, dejamos la palabra para si alguien más quiere preguntar.
Preguntaba sobre los promitios y epimitios en las fábulas esópicas particularmente, eh, porque bueno, yo justo estoy haciendo unas traducciones sobre fábulas esópicas y estaba en la pregunta en el grupo si dejábamos las moralejas, o sea, en realidad las moralejas de epimitios sería, o las sacábamos. Y bueno, justamente esta charla me hizo repensar mucho esa decisión. ¿Qué pensaban ustedes sobre este tema de las moralejas de las fábulas esópicas que son añadidos posteriores, realizados por, obviamente que no estaban en la composición original, en la circulación oral de estas fábulas, si convendría dejarlas en una traducción o convendría más quizá repensarlas de otra manera.
Okay.
I need some help with that one. I didn't
Yes.
follow the whole
Her
question.
her question is about epimitios, because she is translating some fables, and they were thinking about the convenience or not of leaving these morals there or not, as if they might have been added by the writers. And what's your position? I think it's quite clear what your position is, but let's answer again.
Well, at the end of the talk, I mentioned a book that you should look at, Leticia. It is Aesop Without Morals by Lloyd Daly. And he did leave out all the epimithia. He thought they were added. It's not appropriate. He put them in the back of the book. And I can understand that. I prefer the morals inside the story. So that's why I started using that word, endomithium, because I think that's really the powerful moral. But the morals that get added are so interesting. And we're often fooled because there's a lot of variety in those epimithia. I don't know which fables you are translating, but if you look at the Greek prose Aesop, there's a wonderful edition. And I think, Milena, we've circulated the handout with all my references, the 10 Aesop books, the 2-page handout with all the different Aesop. I'll put it in the chat. There's an edition of the Greek prose Aesop by a French scholar named Chambry that has many versions of each Greek prose fable. And the different versions even have different epimithia. In most of the editions of the Greek prose Aesop, they give you only one version. But I would urge you, if you are working on the Greek prose Aesop, to look at the other versions, because sometimes there's more than one epimithium. You know? So let me put the link to that handout in the chat. So.
Bueno, la respuesta, alcancé a tomar nota esta vez. La respuesta de Laura es que, como ella comentó y como está en el final, en la conclusión de la traducción que presentó, que compartió Mile, está este libro de Esopo sin moralejas de Lloyd Daly, donde las moralejas aparecen al final, sea promitios o epimitios. Y no es la postura que Laura está defendiendo, porque sobre todo lo que es los endomitios tienen una fuerza, un énfasis particular, y a la vez es interesantísimo recuperar todas las moralejas que se fueran agregando y que, aunque algunos académicos puedan pensar que el lector no entiende, we are fooled, todas estas adiciones son importantes también de interpretar. Y está agregando en el chat algo que preguntó si estaba en el handout o no. Mire, eso lo tenés que responder vos.
Sí, ahí está. Claro, los links a las ediciones con las distintas versiones de la fábula de Esopo que Laura mencionó, Chambry, por ejemplo, Chambry, que la conocemos, eso compartió Laura recién. Leticia also is working on her thesis about Aesop, so she also worked with us and read your thesis.
So let's stay in touch. I'm glad to answer questions or share resources. This edition of Chambry online is very hard to find the print edition, because in the first edition only, he had 2 volumes, all the variations. But in the next edition, they made him take out all the variations and they only published 1 volume. So it's very exciting that the old edition is online with all the variations now, so everybody can read all the variations. It's like folklore, but written. You know, when they copied, they didn't copy word for word. They told the story and they gave the moral as they saw it, each editor. So.
Claro. Dice Laura que hay dos versiones que de esta edición de Chambrí. La segunda tuvieron que recortar las versiones y quedó una sola definitiva, pero en cambio en la primera, que se puede encontrar y que es maravilloso eso, que esté disponible en internet, eh, hay diferentes versiones que simulan un poco esta cuestión del folclore porque no, digamos, simulan la oralidad, ¿no? No de la escritura donde se marca, se fija una idea. Bueno, ¿alguna otra pregunta, otra intervención? Si no, I wanted to ask you, Héctor, about this idea that you mentioned at the beginning of the work, about the cross-pollination. If you can explain more that idea. I was
Yeah,
struggling with the translation about that term in Spanish, so it's very difficult.
think
Sounds wrong, but that's a phenomenon. So I wanted to ask, how do you think that idea?
Hector, speak very quickly.
quickly. Oh, I speak quickly.
More slowly.
Slowly. Yes, sorry.
Ah.
I am a naturally fast talker. I apologize. Yeah.
Me too.
This idea of cross-pollination is so important. Think about what bees do. Bees don't just stay in one garden, right? And when we think of Aesop's fables, people think these are only Greek and these are only Roman stories. And then when they go to medieval Europe, these are only Greek and these are only Roman stories. But the feeder's fable is a fable that is found in Indian folk traditions. It's found in Iranian folk traditions. It's found later on in Mesoamerican folk traditions. So it's this same story. It's just taking on a new life in different contexts. So the little Aesop bee takes this fable and drops it in Rome. And then the Aesop bee takes it from Rome to Mexico, takes it from Mexico to Spain. And how does that fable sprout a new flower in a different context? And how is it read differently? How does and that's why I am not a fan of the epimythiums, because these epimythiums are perhaps almost like red herrings that point away from the fable. They don't let us look at the fable. We just look for the moral, but we have to remind ourselves, how is that moral taking shape in a different culture? And why is it taking shape in a different culture? So if we look at the fable as something that is being cross-pollinated by Christians, by Jews, by Muslims, by indigenous people, what kind of cultural ideologies, what kind of religious ideologies, what kind of cultural biases what is this fable absorbing? And I think that's what I mean by cross-pollination, that it may be the same story, but it has all these different layers to it. And I think that's what ultimately it means to me.
Ok. Para a quienes le interese, la pregunta de Milena era ¿por qué usa el término de polinización cruzada? Y Héctor dice que a él le gusta pensar en esta imagen de una abeja que toma una fábula en Grecia y la deja en Roma, y la toma en Roma, y la deja en India, o en Irán, o en Mesoamérica. Entonces, no es solo que estemos hablando de fábulas de la literatura griega y latina, sino que en cada contexto esta misma fábula toma una nueva vida. Es así como esta abeja que polinizó en distintos lugares, en distintas culturas, obtiene una nueva flor. Esta nueva flor es la fábula que se lee distinto. Héctor dice que no es un gran fanático de las moralejas de tipo epimitios, porque pueden ser señuelos que encasillen nuestra interpretación. Y en realidad lo importante, lo interesante es la distinta forma que toma esta misma este mismo relato en cada cultura, sea cristiana, sea judía, musulmana, aborigen, siempre va a tener un sesgo cultural y es como que va sumando capas, capas, capas de significado.
Gracias, Sandra. Y thank you, Hector. I love that metaphor. So that's what I wanted to ask you about, because I'm working with fable as children literature. So that's an idea very interesting. That's a very interesting idea. So thank
Yes,
you.
very, very, a very powerful image.
Yes. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna otra pregunta? Si no, podemos ir cerrando.
Well, Laura and Hector, sorry if we have mispronounced your names. We have turned them into Spanish names, yes? So please excuse us if we have told you Hector and Laura so many times.
Yes.
It usually
That's fine.
happens. It usually happens.
When I lived in Poland, the name Laura is not used there at all. And so they turned me into a full 3 syllables, Laura. Laura. So
That's
I'm used to
great.
everything.
You've been
That's great.
Spanishized, Laura. Sí.
Okay.
Sandra le dijo que disculpe que la llamamos Laura en español, hispanizamos su nombre. Y Laura comentó que cuando estuvo en Polonia, volvieron su nombre de 3 sílabas. Bueno, ahí en el chat están poniendo también, están agradeciendo a ambos.
Y Leticia
Eh,
tiene una pregunta más.
No, something very quickly. No, I was thinking about, I'm going to try to express myself in English. Sorry for that. I was thinking about these fables like the wolf and the lamb, and how he has like these final words that, but like the ability to respond, but he doesn't get it to change his fate. And I was thinking about reading that fable along with another one that is called The Wolf and the Sheep, in which the wolf starts a conversation with the sheep, and at the end he forgives her life in base of that conversation. So I thought that it was really powerful how we can get a lot of different readings in the same Aesopic corpus.
Exactly. I have to say, Hector's reading of the Fevers Fable made me like it more, because normally I want the lamb to trick the wolf, right? Because there are all those things about the little animal caught by the wolf. They trick the wolf in order to get away, or like the sheep who uses speech to get away. You know, it is possible to get away from the wolf, and the lamb did not succeed. But when you put the fables together, you see other potential. I think that is the best way to read fables, to see their potential, is put one next to another and compare exactly like that.
And I would just even go a step further, put that fable in dialogue with the other renditions of that fable. We have a Greek version where the sheep is told he wanders away from the flock. So we should not feel bad for the sheep because he doesn't listen to his mom and dad. We have pictorial traditions where the sheep is depicted in fancy clothes and the wolf is depicted in impoverished clothes. So who do we feel bad for? Do we feel bad for the wolf who's being picked on by the rich sheep? Is the rich sheep meant to be killed off? So, it's also fun to just put the fable in dialogue with its cousin fables. And I think that is also another avenue worthwhile.
And I have to say too, this fable of the wolf and the lamb has a parallel in the Buddhist Jataka tales. And in that one, it's really fascinating because the Buddha tells the story of how the lamb did not get away, how the small animal did not get away from the big animal. It's a panther in the Buddha story, but it's set in the context of a real life story of an animal who did get away. So if you're working on the wolf and the lamb, look at the Buddhist Jataka of the wolf and the lamb. I'm writing in the chat. I can send you the reference if you send me an email. I will put my email address in the chat because the Buddhist version is very different. So.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. So thank you very much.
And I'm currently working on this fable and how it was translated into children's literature. So I'm also happy to send on some fun recommendations.
Yes, I love them. Please share that recommendation.
Yeah, put your email in the chat, and then they will have both our emails.
Pongan los correos de quienes quieren. Recomendas. Ah, ahí está el de Héctor. Genial. Ahí Héctor comparte su mail para pedirle si a alguien le interesa continuar el tema. Bueno, no sé si ya les parece, podemos saber si hay alguna otra pregunta. Eh, no sé, Ivana, si decimos algo, si cerramos,
Bueno,
¿te parece?
muchas gracias, Laura, Héctor. We are very happy.
Yes.
It's wonderful, it's wonderful. Gracias a Milena, que estableció el contacto con Laura para este cierre maravilloso. Y gracias a Sandra. Sandra, te amamos.
Lo mismo por aquí.
Okay, thank
all
you,
the,
Ivana.
all the presentation was great because it was so clear and so complete, and it has helped us to think of so many new angles, and well, you are going to answer our emails, so that's a bonus. That's a bonus, and we feel so happy after sharing and hearing and listening to you. This has been marvelous. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes,
and please feel free to write me in Spanish. I can read Spanish. I just can't speak or understand hearing it. But write me in Spanish. That's fantastic.
That's wonderful.
You
really went back and forth through Esopo fables, so that will be wonderful to continue the conversation.
Yes.
Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias entonces a quienes se sumaron, estuvieron presentes. Cualquier cosa, si quieren volver a escuchar la hermosa exposición que hicieron Laura y Héctor, la vamos a estar subiendo grabada. Y bueno, entonces con esto damos por cerrado nuestro ciclo Junio Clásico 2024. Agradecerles nuevamente. So many thank yous, Laura and Héctor. And bueno, espero que lo hayan disfrutado tanto como nosotros.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.